Today we're going to talk about risk management frameworks, which are the foundations of an organisation's approach to risk management. The concept of the risk management framework isn't as well understood as it should be, and many organisations seem to believe that the framework is in fact a document. Throughout the world, corporate governance requirements require organisations to prove that they have an effective approach to managing risk. This must mean that they express their intentions clearly and match those intentions with appropriate capacity to manage risk. So we're going to concentrate in this presentation on the framework aspect of risk management. I'll discuss its major elements and components and what is its overall purpose. We'll also talk about how we can demonstrate the effectiveness of the organisation's framework and report upon it, and how this links to the new requirements in ASX Principle 7. Prior to ISO 31000, we talked about a risk management system prevailing in an organisation and linked that to the organisation's system of management. When we were preparing ISO 31000, we became aware of the ambiguity caused by the word system. System, in many cases, was taken to mean the IT or database system that was used to support risk management and not the management system as a whole. There was another reason at that time to avoid using the word system in relation to risk management, and that was that some companies were adverse to standards which prescribed how they should manage. We therefore adopted the word framework to describe the way the organisation went about risk management, how it expressed its capability and grounded its intentions. ISO 31000 defines the risk management framework as a set of components that provide the foundations and organisational arrangements for designing, implementing, monitoring, reviewing, and continually improving risk management throughout the organisation. While that definition is accurate, it doesn't give a lot of hints as to the practical manifestation of the framework and its components. What we can see from that definition is that the framework for risk management is very similar to the framework or system for the management of the organisation, in that it involves organisational arrangements for designing and implementing and monitoring, reviewing, and continually improving the organisation, particularly in relation to how it makes decisions and therefore how it manages risk. The relationship between good governance and effective risk management is well known. Governance and risk management are symbiotic. They are an integral part of one another, and this is the reason that most corporate governance codes around the world require effective risk management in the organisation. Governance is the system by which the organisation is controlled, how it operates, and the mechanisms by which and its people are held to be accountable. Risk management is the way the organisation is controlled, how decisions are made, and the mechanisms we make people accountable for those decisions, for the risk concerned, and the controls we put in place to modify the risks. The third edition of the Australian Securities Exchange Corporate Governance Principles and Recommendations came out earlier in 2014. All previous editions of the code had included requirements relating to risk and risk management. But the requirements in the two previous editions were mainly concerned with the companies having policies for certain selected risks, which the code called its material risks. There was less emphasis on the framework for managing risk and less importance was placed on producing reports which demonstrated the effectiveness of that framework. That has changed in the third edition. This is an extract from the new Principle 7. The principle itself is that the listed entity should establish a sound risk management framework and should periodically review the effectiveness of that framework. The associated guidance makes the point that it is the role of management to design and implement the framework. It's not the role of the board to design the framework. However, it is the role of the board to oversee the framework and to satisfy itself that the framework is sound. In fact, the guidance makes the point that at least annually the board or a committee of the board should review the risk management framework to ensure that it continues to be sound. In other words, that it is effective in managing risk. The footnote to Principle 7 aligns the term risk management framework with the definition in Australian Standard ISO 31000-2009. As we see later, while it is helpful to discuss risks and how they're controlled with the board, the new Principle 7 doesn't necessarily require companies to disclose their major or most significant risks to the board, but rather to concentrate on how well all risks are being managed, in other words, how they're being identified, analysed, evaluated, treated, monitored and reviewed as part of a continuous process associated with decision making in the organisation. The financial services sector regulator, APRA, has just released the final version of Prudential Standard CPS 220, and this contains similar requirements in relation to the provision of risk management frameworks. It says that APRA-regulated institutions must have a risk management framework that are appropriate for the organisation, that the board should have a strategy that describes the risk management framework and how that will be implemented in the organisation. In fact, it makes the point that the board should have a business plan which deals with the organisation's strategic objectives, which must include the management of risk. Notably, the requirement is also that APRA have to be notified by the board if there is a significant breach or material deviation from the risk management framework in the organisation. So what is a risk management framework? What are its elements and components, and how can we prove that it is sound? How can we report on that soundness? The first thing I think we have to say is that the framework exists as part of the organisation's system of management and therefore is not a document. Some organisations prepare a document and they call that document their framework. However, all the document can do is describe the architecture and provide a blueprint for the framework. It is not itself the framework. Indeed, sadly, many of the documents that do purport to be frameworks are in fact no more than descriptions of rating systems and possibly extensions on the existing policy statements. In other words, at best, they're expressions of intentions and they don't reflect how the organisation will build capacity to reflect those intentions and therefore manage risk. So the framework is a collection of things, stuff, if you like, that the organisation brings together as part of its system of management to help it deal with the effect of uncertainty on its objectives. Those things and stuff are deployed whenever the organisation is faced with a decision or has to plan for the future. There are two broad parts to the framework. The first being an expression of the organisation's intentions. how it signals through the words, actions, and of course the written materials generated by senior management, what, why, and how risk will be managed. The how component is vital to ensure that there is consistent and coherent decision making across the organisation. The why provides the motivation. It links the effective management of risk to the achievement of the organisation's goals and objectives. In other words, without effective risk management, the organisation cannot be successful. Complementary to those expressions of intentions should be the capacity to manage risk. And this is the area where we find most organisations are deficient. They're quite happy to express their policies and intentions, but then they struggle to match those by the required level of capacity. Capacity, of course, requires tools to enable people to manage risk more effectively, but it also requires people to have the capability to use those tools, and that implies training and motivation systems to build the capacity. As the organisation changes, as its external and internal environment changes, then its approach to managing risk must also change. And a vital part of the framework has to be the ability to manage change, to respond to change, to adapt and continuously improve the way that risk is managed. Drawing a picture of a risk management framework is not easy. Every organisation is structured differently, and all organisations manage differently, and all organisations manage risk differently, as is appropriate. ISO 31000 contains at Clause 4 the instructions and advice on how the risk management framework should be developed, implemented, and continually improved. However, the diagram within Clause 4 does not give much information about the components of a framework. It only describes the process that leads to the development, implementation, and enhancement of the framework. What you'll see with this slide is Broadleaf's view on the general architecture of a framework. The 4 boxes are the key elements in the framework, and these are based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. And within each of the boxes, as bullet points, are the components which we think are essential for effective risk management. In other words, if any of these components are missing or inferior, then the organisation will not be managing risk fully, effectively, and fully efficiently. You will see here that there is an outer cycle which prevails at an organisational level, and within that is suspended and supported the risk management process that operates at an operational level in support of decisions. The first element of the framework is where the organisation expresses its intentions with respect to the management of risk. And it should do this through the normal mechanisms it adopts, such as setting policies and delegating authority down through its structure. Many organisations also specify requirements in the forms of standards or codes that they expect their employees to follow when working for them, when making decisions, and when acting. These requirements are supported by guides and procedures that specify best practice methods that should be adopted across the organisation. And of course, expressed intention is not just about saying what you wish to achieve, but also how you wish to achieve it. And vitally, this element includes the strategies that the organisation intends to adopt for a more effective risk management and the plans it makes, often known as risk management plans, for the implementation and enhancement of risk management. And finally, the plans it makes for the assurance of risk management to ensure that its intentions are being followed. The second element of the framework is, I'm afraid, often the weakest. There does seem to be a belief in some organisations that just by writing a policy statement and setting out requirements, employees will always follow what they've been told to do and will change their behaviour and their attitude. That, in fact, is rarely the case unless they are provided with training and motivation. So an important part of building capability is to train people at all levels, from the board downwards, as to what is risk and how it should be managed as part of decision making within the organisation. The training is of course supported by communications, and the strategy for that should approach all stakeholders, both internal and external, and engage them in the management of risk. All stakeholders, and particularly people within the organisation, benefit from the collation and analysis of information, particularly drawing upon data which is relevant for the management of risk. And finally, in this element, increasingly organisations understand that there is great benefit from coordinating facilitators and practitioners in a specific area, in this case risk management, to leverage their skills and share knowledge. And these networks can be an important part of building capability. The third element of the framework concerns the allocation of accountability. The bodies, groups and individuals concerned with ensuring effective management of risk. It starts at the top with the board or alternative oversight body. Often this accountability is delegated down to a subcommittee, such as the audit or an audit and risk, or even a risk subcommittee. It's important that the members of that committee understand their role and also understand risk and how it should be managed. There is obviously a training need at that level. It's also important that the charter for that body clearly identifies its role and ensures that there isn't duplication of effort between the oversight body and management. Beneath the oversight body, there's normally a leadership group. It can be the executive committee or some other senior management group that gives direction and provides resources for risk management. This group is also concerned with the performance of the risk management framework and ensuring that there is suitable progress with the risk management plan. The leadership group is supported by facilitators. In some organisations, we still call them risk managers, though increasingly they're known as managers of risk management or risk management leads, or even chief risk officers. They are the custodians of the framework, and their purpose is to help the rest of the organisation manage risk more effectively in keeping with the organisation's policies. They are supported by embedded practitioners, people throughout the organisation who have normal jobs but who also occasionally work in the risk management area. They have to be change agents, and often they're specialists in particular risks or in the treatment of particular types of risks. People are also made accountable for the major risks the organisation faces and also for the key controls that are in place to modify those risks. Those people need training in those roles, and they also should be quite clear of what's expected of them. Particularly control managers, control owners need to be quite clear as to how they should be monitoring those key controls and reporting to risk owners if the controls are deficient or absent at any time. The fourth element of the framework is also one which is unfortunately not as well developed as one would wish in many organisations. Here we are using conventional performance measurement and continual improvement tools to drive forward risk management. We're talking about understanding our performance against certain performance standards using KPIs, periodically evaluating our effectiveness, and we'll see later how we can use management self-assessment methodologies for that. Occasionally obtaining the view of third-party assurance providers as to how effective our framework is, and particularly drawing valuable information through benchmarking internally between different departments and divisions. These reviews should be collated and aggregated, and that should lead to periodic revision of the framework so that the cycle is completed. So you can see therefore that the risk management framework is not a document. It's always a good idea to describe the elements of the framework and how they should perform in some document, but the framework itself cannot be a document. It has to be an integral part of the organisation's system of management. You may also note that although we have lots of the elements of the organisation's system of management given in the diagram, none of them are badged as risk something or other. We haven't put risk in front of policies or risk in front of plans or risk in front of training. This is deliberate. Managing risk is simply a way of understanding and dealing with the effect of uncertainty on the organisation's objectives as part of decision making. And if we have separate artifacts labelled in terms of risk or risk management, this tends to externalise or disintegrate the risk management process from decision making. It makes it separate and different and prevents it from being properly assimilated. So while we might start our framework and start our enhancement of the framework by having separate risk management training and separate risk management policies and separate risk management standards and so on, to be fully effective and to have an integrated approach to risk management, we need to drop those labels. We just need to have the organisation's policies which include the management of risk. We need a delegation of authority system which is based on risk. We need training for a variety of reasons, and those training courses will include the management of risk. For example, we could run training on procurement and have within it how risk is managed as part of decision making during procurement. The ISO 31000 risk management process doesn't include any step labelled reporting. Reporting is never a good reason to go through a risk management process. It is entirely incidental to the management of risk. Understanding risk, responding to risk, treating risks, monitoring risks and controls, they're all essential parts of the risk management process, and reporting on them is always incidental. Indeed, it's part of communication and consultation, and its purpose is to engage and inform stakeholders. However, when it comes to corporate governance, it is important that we provide sufficient information to the oversight body to enable it to understand what are our major risks and how effective are we at managing them. In fact, we need to go more than that. We need them to understand how effective as a whole our approach to risk management is. How good is our framework, and is it soundly based? In the past, and in many companies still, the information supplied to the board is really about risks, the list of risks. Often the magic list of risks, the magic 10 risks which the organisation thinks are its most significant. There are obviously problems associated with this because who knows what the risks are tomorrow if those were the risks of yesterday? And who, from looking at that risk, can really judge if the organisation has an effective process for managing risk associated with its decisions. It is, however, useful to provide risk information to the board. For example, what are the major risks we think we face? Because then we can describe the controls we believe we have in place to modify those risks, and critically, how do we check, how do we monitor that those controls are in place and effective at all times? Where we have detected that controls are inadequate, there is a control gap, then what have we decided to do about it? What risk treatment have we planned, and what is our progress with that risk treatment? Now, we can send the risk register or the list of risks with this ancillary information to the board, but many organisations now feel that it's much more persuasive to deal with this on a thematic basis and to have a cycle of discussions throughout the year, sometimes called a stewardship cycle, where at each meeting of the Oversight Committee, a risk owner or risk owners turn up and talk about their risks, talk about the key controls, talk about how they're monitored, and talk about any further risk treatment that's required. The intention is that over a period of time, we use this information to demonstrate to the Oversight Committee that in fact we hold a current, correct and comprehensive understanding of our risks, and that we're able to persuade them that we believe the levels of risk are currently within the organisation's risk criteria. And if they're not, then we have plans in place to treat the risks further so that they will become acceptable within a period of time. Some organisations still satisfy the requirement to provide reports to directors by giving them a copy of the risk register. These can often be very large documents printed on A3 sheets of paper with numerous columns and a large number of lines, each one pertaining to a risk. It must be quite daunting for a director in such a company to be faced by such a document, to have to wade through it and somehow sieve out and rationalise the information so that you can draw some meaningful conclusions about the effectiveness of risk management in the organisation. Such approaches to reporting also prevent the organisation from giving itself appropriate credit for what it knows and what it does. What we see on this slide is the top page of a report taken from one of our clients that contains a summary of all the salient information that the management team believe the directors need to have about the risks the company faces, the key controls that it puts in place and their status, and on the risk management framework and the performance of that framework. The boxes on the right-hand side of the report are used by management to demonstrate the depth of their understanding, to explain the situation, and to describe what steps have been taken to improve matters if these are required. If we do supply some form of risk register to the oversight body, then it should be condensed, it shouldn't have numerous columns, and it should be easily read from one side to the other. Risks should be described in terms of what could occur, what it could lead to in terms of the appropriate objectives, what are the causes, what are the existing controls, and then a minimal amount of risk analysis information. Particularly, we can use arrows within the risk management information, the risk analysis information, to show trends. We can show, as in this case, how control effectiveness has changed over time, how the level of risk has changed, and we can also, at the end of this register, show what are the planned treatment actions and our progress in completing them. We can also demonstrate that we have developed an understanding of the risk through appropriate analysis. And you'll see on this slide a page from the report that shows two forms of matrix. These are not the normal consequence likelihood matrices, but rather they show analyses that bring out those risks which we deem the most important for risk treatment and those risks which the senior management team will themselves oversee to ensure that risk treatment proceeds as promptly as possible. The figure on the left-hand side plots level of risk against control effectiveness, and the risks within the rectangle, the red rectangle, are those which we suggest are of the highest priority for risk treatment. They're the ones where the risk is already high and we're admitting that the controls are significantly less than fully effective. The notes beneath that figure should allow management to explain why they've come to those conclusions and what actions they're taking. On the right-hand side, we show control effectiveness against potential exposure. Potential exposure is the potential maximum consequences for a risk given the existing controls are missing or have failed. It very much reflects a worst-case consequence. And risks within the red rectangle are those where we admit the controls are poor, and the consequences, if the controls are poor, could be very serious indeed. Those are certainly the ones which senior management will wish to pursue and ensure that the risk treatment plans are swiftly executed. Again, the notes under that figure enable management to provide justification for their action and explain their strategies for the oversight of those important risks and their treatment. While the information in the preceding 3 slides is interesting, it is only providing collateral evidence that the organisation has an effective approach to managing risk. And to be frank, we could draw up those diagrams without having a good framework for managing risk, without having a comprehensive process for managing risk throughout the organisation that links to all forms of key decision making. None of this information shows if the organisation's approach to managing risk is effective, and therefore, if we present that type of risk information to our board, they can't conduct their reviews and satisfy their duty in accordance with the new requirements of ASX Principle 7. To show how effective is our approach to risk management, to show what our framework is and demonstrate that it's actually working, we have to look at the performance of risk management and the risk management framework. And the conventional way of doing that is to set some standards and then measure our performance against those standards. And here's some examples drawn from one of our clients. They felt that it was important that risk treatment plans were progressed, and therefore they wanted to measure the percentage of risk treatment tasks outstanding compared with the last quarter. Secondly, being a contractor, they want to ensure that there is good risk assessment associated with tendering, and in particular that bids were subject to risk assessment before tenders were submitted. They therefore wanted to measure the number of bids submitted that did or did not include good risk assessment. They also wanted to make sure that key controls are being monitored, and they set up plans and programs for that, and they wanted to know their progress with the completion of those plans and programs. The organisation was quite concerned that it wasn't learning lessons from projects that have failed in the past, and therefore it wanted to include more root cause analysis as part of post-project reviews to check that controls were still working and to learn lessons from any weaknesses and also from successes. And therefore it put KPIs in place in terms of the number of root cause analyses conducted and the effectiveness of those analyses in terms of generating improvement tasks. Overall, the company adopted a risk management effectiveness evaluation process. Some companies call this risk management maturity evaluation. And as we'll see later, they wanted to get a year-on-year improvement in the overall evaluation score across the organisation. That evaluation technique was a diagnostic tool that led to a new risk management plan each year. The plan was actually to improve and enhance risk management. And again, they set KPIs in terms of the proportion of tasks which would be completed within that plan. Now you can start to see that we have lots of evidence, very tangible information, which we can present to the board that shows that we are effective at managing risk, that our framework is in place and that it is working. Here you can see an example of a risk management performance report for the company we discussed earlier. There are two figures here. The first one at the top shows a simplified Gantt chart which demonstrates progress with the tasks in the risk management plan. Those tasks are down the left-hand side. The blue column indicates the time now, and the tasks are coloured as red being behind schedule, green meaning ahead of schedule, and grey still outstanding. The comments box on the right allows management to discuss the performance to date and to make recommendations on any further actions need to be taken to ensure that the risk management plan is completed on time. Beneath that is a graph showing the progress with risk treatment actions. This also allows a comparison of the current and the previous period's performance. You'll see here that the bars are for those tasks that are overdue, together with those due in 30, 60 days, and also those where the task was created and nobody has agreed a date for completion. There are two stacked bars, two sets of stacked bars. One shows the previous period, one the current period, and the colorations on the bars reflect the levels of risk, the priority, the high, medium, low levels of risk. Again here, the comments box on the right-hand side can be used for management to discuss the performance to date and to suggest what further steps will be taken to improve that performance in the future. Many organisations now appreciate the benefits from a self-evaluation process for risk management effectiveness. This is sometimes called maturity evaluation. Some organisations still rely on third-party audit providers to conduct these reviews, but increasingly we find companies want to take ownership of this and to realise the full benefits from such methodologies. We see here the output from a company-run performance evaluation and maturity evaluation. Typically, they have set themselves 6 principles which they wish to satisfy throughout the organisation, and they've measured their performance against each one of these principles. This is normally achieved by a series of questions that sit beneath each principle. Each one has to be scored in terms of management's intentions and performance in practice. And as you'll see here, they've improved their performance from an overall score of 13.3 to 31.8 between the two reporting periods. And those results are shown graphically below. Now, these techniques are very useful in that they provide a diagnostic tool that enables the management team to understand the gaps and weaknesses and therefore provide the basis for the next year's risk management plan. They also provide the means for benchmarking across an organisation so that we can leverage best practice. And some organisations link these scores to performance indicators for departments, divisions, groups, or even individuals. And in some organisations, the change in performance is linked to the remuneration, the bonus structure for the organisation. The protocol that is used for evaluation can also be used as the basis for an external or internal audit program that focuses on risk management. So auditors no longer have to impose their own paradigms. Their role is to validate management's own self-assessment using this company-specific protocol. The results can also be used for the allocation of insurance premiums across the organisation. Those departments or areas that achieve good progress can receive a rebate in terms of the allocation of insurance premium. And finally, such performance indicators can be used outside the normal governance process. For example, can be presented to insurers and reinsurers to demonstrate that the organisation not only has an effective approach to managing risk, but that it is being improved and enhanced in a structured and systematic way each year. Clearly, such information is of great interest to the board or oversight body. It demonstrates that the organisation understands the necessary requirements for an effective framework for risk management and is taking steps to improve the existing framework and enhancing over time. The output from such evaluation processes are often a plan, an enhancement strategy, a series of steps and actions that need to be taken. And summaries of these are very persuasive in terms of convincing the board or oversight body that the organisation is serious about the management of risk and is taking the right steps to improve its framework and approach. This report is taken from another company standard report. You'll see here the 4 elements of the risk management framework on the left-hand side and the components associated with each one of those. For each component, the company has indicated whether there is a basis for compliance with that component already in place, and in all cases, the opportunities for improvement. Those opportunities for improvement are simply worded to convey what is the problem and what actions are being taken. The company has indicated its priorities for the current financial year and the status of each of the actions in the final right-hand column. Very simple report, extremely powerful information, conveys a great deal about the organisation's ability to understand its approach to managing risk and enhance it over a period of time. It even allows them to indicate the areas that they think are in greatest need of improvement and to prioritise those within the current financial year. So organisations should be able to demonstrate that their approach to managing risk is soundly based, that they have a sound framework to enable them to manage risk comprehensively and coherently. Just presenting risk information, just sending the board a risk register means not a lot. In fact, that risk information doesn't have any credibility unless it's supported by information about the framework which is used to generate it. This means that any reporting that takes place to the board or oversight body has to focus on the framework and the performance of the framework. Of course, to do this, an organisation has to understand what is its framework for managing risk. What are the gaps? What are the areas that require improvement? How could we improve its effectiveness? And has to be able to report all of that to the board or oversight body. Now, this is specifically the case for Australian organisations listed on the Australian Securities Exchange or those who are controlled entities under APRA. But it is also true of all jurisdictions around the world. Stakeholders and shareholders require organisations to demonstrate that there is an effective approach to the management of risk. Thank you.